Welcome to Carnegie Politika podcast. My name is Alex Gabuev. I'm director of Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. And today we're going to talk about the countries that sit between Russia and Euro-Atlantic structures. They have been space for contestation between the West and Russia. And recently, my colleague Maxim Samarukov and our colleagues from Carnegie Europe Center in Brussels have embarked on studying this region and finding out what that really means for regional security and for broader confrontation between Russia and the West. I'm joined by one of the authors of this exciting study, Tom de Waal, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe Center. Welcome, Tom.
Great to be with you, Sasha.
And welcome back. And my colleague, Rosa Balfour, who is director of Carnegie Europe Center in Brussels. Welcome, Rosa.
Good morning, Sasha. Good morning, Tom.
It's great to have you guys. And let's jump into that straight. Tom, I think that the reality of countries between Russia and Euro-Atlantic structures, NATO, EU, has been there since collapse of the Soviet Union. And some countries were sitting in different organizations. Moscow hosted Collective Security Treaty Organization and then Eurasian Economic Union. Some embarked very early on joining NATO and the EU. And there is still space in between that. So this reality has been there for 30 years, though the number of countries have been changing. What has happened that makes this problem so acute after the war? What has the war in Ukraine brought any new dynamics to that situation?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I would say that Russia definitely, of course, crossed a Rubicon by its war in Ukraine, the invasion of a sovereign neighbor, which made all the other neighbors, look to their choices suddenly much, much more seriously. Suddenly Russia is no longer the potential security patron. Suddenly Russia is the threat. It's the disruptor. And we're looking at a totally different environment, an environment which is much more predictable, where Russia is prepared to use violence against its neighbors. The game has suddenly got dirtier and more desperate. Now, if you're in Central Asia, I've also written about this in a recent Carnegie Europe study called End of the Near Abroad. If you're in Central Asia or in Azerbaijan, you have a one-party state. I think you're better equipped to deal with Russia. You talk the same language. You're not going to aspiring to join the EU or NATO. You can do business with Russia more easily. I think the countries we're looking at are the kind of the democracies where there's a Western segment of the population which wants democracy, wants rule of law, wants the public goods that the West can offer. And feels increasingly threatened by Russia. So we're looking at Moldova, we're looking at Armenia and Georgia. Georgia is a particularly interesting case because the regime seems to be looking one way and the society another. And we're also looking at the Western Balkans. But I think in all these cases, suddenly the game has got a lot more challenging. If before you were looking at sort of peaceful coexistence between Russia and the West over these countries, Russia didn't really used to have a strong objection to countries joining the EU. NATO used to be the red line. Now the EU is a red line as well. And so that's why we're seeing the kind of language of threat used towards Moldova and in a slightly different way towards Georgia and to Armenia.
All the countries that you describe have very different circumstances. And I think that Armenia still sits in the Collective Security Treaty Organization and is still a member of Eurasian Economic Union, although it's not paying its fees to CSTO. And it says that it wants to put a distance between itself and any Moscow-controlled organization, where the invitation has been rolled out to Georgia under certainly conditions which are probably now not necessarily fulfilled with the passing of foreign agents law, and Moldova, which probably is on a better track. And then there are Western Balkans, particularly Bosnia and Herzegovina. So is there a spectrum of these countries that are in different circumstances?
Yeah, there are all sorts of different spectrums. There's a democratic spectrum that they're on, but also geography obviously matters. When you're looking at Moldova, which is between Romania and Ukraine, or you're looking at the Western Balkans surrounded by the EU, then they have a kind of buffer against Russia. If you're looking at Georgia or Armenia, the neighborhood, is much more uncomfortable for those countries, the choices they make. And obviously, we're all scratching our heads as to why suddenly within 6 months, the government of Georgia went from being offered EU candidate status to, going full front attack against EU officials, EU institutions. Well, one reason for that, and I'm not justifying them at all, I think they've made a big miscalculation. But in their mind, one reason for that is this feeling of vulnerability towards Russia, that Russia is right on our border. Russian troops are in South Ossetia, 40 or 50 kilometers away, and the EU is across the Black Sea. So we have to come up with a different solution to this issue. And in the Georgians' government's view, that is basically a policy that we would call appeasement. It's sort of giving Russia a lot of what it wants in order to preserve your own sovereignty. But of course, in the Georgian case, I would say the issue is that regime has been completely conflated with society. It's much more about the regime survival than it is about the national interest. It's really about buying Russian support for getting back into office in parliamentary elections in October. And this is why we're seeing the standoff, because most of society doesn't buy that they want to take the more risky option, which is the European option.
One of the drivers of the dynamics that you describe, and you describe that in the study at length, is the newly discovered desire for the EU to enlarge. I think that the enlargement project was on the back burner for many years. There has been Eastern Partnership in various forms on how to engage these countries in between rather than offering them a membership path. And now it has changed because of the war. But probably the situation as it was in 2022 when these decisions were made is a little bit different than in summer 2024. So how would you, Rosa, describe the state of this discussion? Is the appetite for enlargement still there? And what's the framework that officials in Brussels and in key European capitals are thinking about it now?
Thank you very much, Sasha. Well, indeed, in 2022 and even throughout 2023, there was more optimism about Ukraine's fate. And at the moment, the military situation in Ukraine, makes us more pessimistic. However, all the signs of that, the commitment towards enlargement in the European Union are still there. Some key decisions will be made in coming months, and maybe we can talk about that later. I think the key point to make here is that aside from the mood around the situation in Ukraine, EU accession is a long-term project. And what happened in 2022, which at that moment might have appeared like a symbolic decision, what actually happened was that the EU started to think differently about its role on the European continent at large. And one pillar of this is that Ukraine and Moldova now have a clear path towards accession. Key decisions will be made quite soon. And actually, they have moved really quickly through the first hurdles towards getting a green light to start accession talks. That decision might come this month, might not, might be a little later, it might be even in 2025. But still, to get to this point in 2 years is actually quite remarkable. The other dimension of this is that this has led to revamping EU commitment towards the Western Balkans. As you mentioned, so the Western Balkan countries have been potential candidates of the European Union basically since 2003, since the Thessaloniki Declaration. 10 years later, a couple of countries started accession talks, and then in the past 10 years, very little has happened. And in these 10 years, the EU has lost an enormous amount of ground, and this is very problematic, both for the Western Balkans, but also to make the accession process with Ukraine and Moldova credible. And if you want, we can talk a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, that would be interesting because it's clear why the discussion in Europe has concluded that Ukraine deserves, after everything what it suffered for its European pro-democracy choice, to be anchored in transatlantic institutions. And NATO is a separate, complicated discussion because of commitments that will come out of Article 5, and it's unclear what line of control is actually feasible, and that definitely Ukraine has all the right to fight its 1991 borders. So this is a complicated discussion where the European Union membership is definitely an easier path. Same goes for Moldova, but like the Balkans seem to be a slightly different case.
Yeah. So let's start with, let's start with Ukraine, Moldova, just because that's what you mentioned first. I mean, ultimately, when the accession prospect becomes closer for these two countries, still the territorial status will be an issue. And indeed, one of the most important changes that happened in EU policy was Macron's speech in Bratislava last year, where he said, we need to enlarge, and this is unusual for France. France has never been a pro-enlargement country. We need to enlarge to Ukraine, but Ukraine also needs to join NATO. Because whatever the situation in terms of sovereignty over its own territory that Ukraine will find itself in, let's assume when there is some kind of cessation of hostilities, the sovereignty question is difficult for the EU as much as it is for NATO. And the EU does entail some lower key Article 5 type commitments. So it will be in the interest of the EU that Ukraine also joins NATO. And I think we're moving towards that. And there are behind closed door discussions about what type of security guarantees can the West give Ukraine. It's not unprecedented for the EU. I mean, we have Germany joined the European Union when it was divided between West and East Germany, and Cyprus also joined. However, since then, the EU has really tried to put resolution of statehood issues before accession. So that's the situation. And we turn now to the Balkans with Serbia and Kosovo. And Serbia, in its accession talks, has an additional chapter that expects the resolution of the dispute between Serbia and Kosovo to be solved before accession. Now, let's move to the Balkans. What has happened there? As a reflection, I would say, of a lukewarm commitment on part of the European Union, the pro-European forces, the pro-democracy and pro-European forces in the Balkans have been weakened. And we've seen state capture in several countries, most notably in Serbia. We've also seen some countries go to incredible lengths in order to solve disputes that were preventing their path on accession. And I'm thinking of North Macedonia, which changed its name in order to overcome the dispute with Greece and have a green light towards accession talks. And then they did this. It was the Prespa Agreement in 2017. It was quite a memorable moment in Balkan politics and in European politics. And then North Macedonia's path towards accession was blocked anyhow by other bilateral disputes. So what we've seen is a disenchantment of the pro-European forces in the region. We've seen the EU leadership rub shoulders with pocket-sized autocrats or would-be autocrats in the region. Both these dynamics have really undermined the attraction of the accession process. And now we find ourselves in a quagmire in the sense that the EU now is committed. The Western Balkans all of a sudden have a window of opportunity to, jump on this train that has been offered to Ukraine and Moldova. And I keep on not mentioning Georgia simply because of the situation in Georgia. But in principle, that window is there for Georgia too. But the region has lost that energy and that drive. We've seen events in Serbia, for instance, where the government has managed to, be reconfirmed through elections. There's virtually democratic opposition has really become minority. So as things stand now, the only country on which the EU can truly invest is actually Montenegro. It's a very small country. It has a pro-European government. In fact, the government has announced that it would like to join the EU, or at least be ready to join by 2028. So there is ambition there. But it is, I wonder to what extent Montenegro joining the European Union will be a sufficient pull factor for the rest of the region to say, right, we actually need to invest in the EU. Because so far, Russia and China have, upped their game in the Balkans and distracted the electorate, the citizens from what was a clear path, and made the leadership hedge between, whatever the best offer comes their way.
And let's talk about that, Tom, because I think that in 2022, there was a lot of analysis that Russia is so bogged down in Ukraine that the tools that it can apply to near abroad in broader sense, but also to the countries in between, is just now limited. Russia doesn't have resources, it doesn't have money, it doesn't have tools of pressure and coercion. So that makes Western hands much stronger in that regard. Would you agree, or there is still a lot of residual power?
Well, I would put it this way. I would say Russia is both weaker and more dangerous in its neighborhood. And obviously its weakness is relative to other powers. So, Russia can spot weakness in the EU. And Russia has, I think, two games here. One is in the countries themselves. It plays with constituencies which are a bit skeptical of Europe and the West, people who are cynical about enlargement, but also culturally conservative groups, Christian groups. It uses the culture wars, the family values agenda with those people, and you see that in Georgia, you see that in Serbia, you see that across the board. And then Russia obviously plays on the weakness of the EU as a whole. And here, I think Hungary is pivotal. Obviously, Hungary is not the only case, but the most conspicuous one, because other countries hide behind Hungary. We may see other countries joining that camp. Austria could, if the elections go to the far right party, join that camp. And because of the unanimity principle in EU foreign policy and the enlargement process, Russia sees that there are friendlier countries which can exercise veto power, and so it can undermine the process from within. So I think Russia is definitely weaker economically. Russia has much less to offer most of these countries, although the South Caucasus trade is actually quite strong with Russia at the moment. But I think Russia is only as weak as the other partners, the EU in particular, is strong, and it can sense weakness in the EU, certainly at the moment.
So, Tom, how do these tools that Moscow applies in various countries that you look into are different? Is it a specialized toolkit for every single one, or there are some unifying patterns?
No, I would say everywhere is different. I mean, if you look at Armenia, for example, formally the relationship is still there. Pashinyan travels to Moscow. Membership of the CSTO is suspended, but not finished, and the Eurasian Economic Union is actually working quite well for Armenia at the moment. So there, it's more the Russian media, it's various, attack dogs in Russia, like, the famous foreign ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, who are attacking Armenia. But at the formal level, not much is going on. But then behind the scenes, you see, Moscow working much more closely with Azerbaijan. You see a lot going on. Moldova, it's much more open, Putin mentions Moldova in his public speeches, and there's clear warnings to Moldova, and I think clear efforts to, mobilize pro-Russian forces in the coming elections this fall and next year. This notorious businessman, Ilan Shor, who was responsible, it seems, for, stealing $1 billion in this banking scandal in Moldova. He's now in Russia. He actually appeared at the St. Petersburg Forum a few days ago with the famous Eurasianist philosopher Alexander Dugin. So there it's different. And then in Georgia, I think Moscow is just sort of saying nothing. It's just sitting and watching and sort of applauding from the sidelines as it sees the Georgian Dream government, attacking the Europeans. So I think, Moscow is playing it differently in each case. And I think what has in common is that this belief that we have the stamina, we're in for the long term. These Westerners are dilettantes, they come and go. But, we have a long-term commitment to these countries that the West never has.
And that just very much underpins Russia's commitment to everything. And its grand strategy is basically to outlast the West, be it Ukraine, countries in between, the global South. You mentioned tools of coercion and subversion. Are there any carrots in Moscow toolbox at all? Like, is there anything positive that Moscow can offer?
Well, again, everywhere is different. I mean, certainly, on the economic level, you can offer much more to Georgian and Armenian farmers because, they can pay a few bribes and they can send all their goods, produce to Russia without any problem. Standards are high, whereas, we know how tough EU standards and certification is for agricultural goods, for example. So in the Caucasus, I think the economic relationship is still quite strong. But in Moldova and the Western Balkans, I think the message is, we don't have the economic benefits that the West has, but we have, this cultural, spiritual bond. We will not take away your children and send them, and change their gender. All these cultural war messages, I think, are much stronger in those cases.
Rosa, does this appetite for enlargement and the whole thinking behind the process change in any significant way after the results of the parliamentary elections in Europe? It's clear that the Eurosceptics have gained some ground overall, but also in critical countries like Germany and France. Macron has called a new parliamentary election, and his vision, the Bratislava speech, were very instrumental and part of the invigoration of this process. So how important is that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The radical right has done well, but it remains divided on Russia. And also on enlargement, although on enlargement, I would say it's more of a problem than not. However, the European Parliament's role in enlargement really it becomes important when it has to agree to the accession of individual countries. And it's highly unlikely that any countries are going to join in the next 5 years, with the potential exception of Montenegro. So in this sense, the European Parliament will not be that influential. However, the elections to the European Parliament, are the first step in a new leadership of the EU more generally. And one very important indicator of the commitment of the EU to enlarge will be in the choice of the next commissioner. If the president of the commission puts forward a package of commissioners, each commissioner is nominated by the member states, but gives a strong commissioner a strengthened portfolio dealing with enlargement, that will speak volumes. So for the past 5 years, the enlargement portfolio was given to a Hungarian, and he has been pursuing a type of diplomacy which is not dissimilar to what Russia is doing. I mean, his best friends are Russia's best friends as well in the region, in the Western Balkans. So all eyes will be on who the next commissioner will be and what type of renewed strategy will come out of Brussels, because that is, I think, a very important step. The EU leadership needs to look at what has been going wrong with the enlargement process, how it can be changed, and needs to develop a credible strategy that will dissuade member states from using their veto powers and from interfering in the accession process as it moves along. This is absolutely critical. So I think the next commission, which will be voted in, shall we say, in the next 6 months, precisely because of the election results, it's going to be quite a fraught process. But it will be critical in determining, to what extent the EU is serious. But I'd like to add one more point to this, because enlargement is one piece of a broader reshaping of the European continent. We have the enlargement process, which, given the challenges and given the different pockets of problems that we get in the whole region, is likely to be flexible and to be tailor-made to certain conditions. So what we're likely to see is a gradual integration of countries into certain policy areas, even if they don't become full members. And this will give some waiting space for outstanding disputes to be solved, for wars to come to an end, etc., etc. But the other bit of it is that, for instance, the UK is going to have elections on the 4th of July. A Labour Party is likely to win, and relations between the EU and the UK are likely to improve. We've also seen a few gatherings of the European political community. So there is a bit of a recasting of the institutional and political landscape on the European continent. And enlargement is one piece of it, but not the only one. And then finally, just thinking about the countries that Tom de Waal and our colleagues have been looking at in these papers that are, one has been published and others are forthcoming. We will see a sort of checkered geography, and countries such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Armenia, they might be in a sort of in between status. So we're seeing a little bit of a change in who the in-between, which countries are in-between countries and which countries have made a far clearer pro-Western choice.
And final question, Tom. Do you have any recommendations on how the West should approach that? And maybe the bandwidth is definitely limited. The West has mounting challenges in Ukraine on its hands. There are multiple internal problems. When dealing with those countries, should there be any regional priorities set that this country is probably more likely to be integrated and fixed soon, and here the bandwidth is really limited?
Well, I mean, again, every case is different. For sure, there's a very difficult challenge now with Georgia, which is clearly a country with quite strong democratic traditions and currently a very undemocratic government. And here there'll be massive focus on the elections in October. I think there is a chance that the Georgian Dream government could be thrown out in the elections in October. And there's also quite a strong chance that they will find a way to win the election by some quite unsavory, dirty means. So I think it's about trying to give support to democratic forces in a society like Georgia, but without trying to take politics off the streets if possible and into the polling stations. That's the case there, But as I say, every case is different. I think when it comes to Armenia, what Armenia needs is a kind of is a message of a kind of long-term economic resilience plan for Armenia to kind of wean it from its dependence on Russia for energy and the economy, and that's going to take a decade. And if there's a kind of long-term plan with some funding attached from the West, that will be significant. Otherwise, when it comes to Moldova and the Western Balkans, it's everything that Rosa's been saying about enlargement, and it's about trying to kind of make that process more credible, to kind of fix the defective mechanisms in the enlargement process, and talk about, and people are also talking about phased enlargement, about trying to kind of, before you actually become a full member of the club with voting rights, maybe you can get some of the benefits, you can get some of privileged access to the single market, which would show citizens of these countries, that there is light at the end of the tunnel for them.
Thank you so much, Rosa and Tom. I encourage everybody to read the excellent study between Russia and the EU, Europe's Arc of Instability, written by Tom and our colleagues Dimitar Bechev and Maxim Samarukov, and very much looking forward to the case studies that you will publish later. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you so much.